quilty friends, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today we are going to work on a binding project with AGF 2.5 edition, which is their specialty binding fabric. You ready? Let's get started. So I have this quilt top that was quilted by my long armor. I've known my long armor a really long time. I met her back when I worked at a quilt shop, which is before my nearly 12-year-old was born. So I've known Tammy a really long time. I sent her my quilts and I said, quilt them however you want. If you could trim them up before sending them back to me, that would be great. And she did, but I forgot that Tammy trims up her quilts a little different than I do, which is actually an opportunity to play with some of this AGF 2.5 edition. So traditionally when I trim up a quilt, I trim it up directly to the edge of the quilt top, but Tammy adds a little extra. So she trims a little bit away from the edge of the quilt top, and she does that because while I like using a 2-inch binding, which is a smaller binding strip, and that wraps tightly around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is why I trim it right up. Tammy likes using a wider binding and then having this extra batting on the edge here, and that extra batting will fill up that binding to give her a nice full binding. So basically, I'm going to use some of Tammy's method of binding a quilt because the 2.5 edition is designed to be cut 2.5 inches. Now I have another video where I did play with the 2.5 edition binding, and I used it at 2 inches, which gives a different look, but I'm going to use it as intended with 2.5. So if you're not familiar with the AGF 2.5 edition, then that's okay. It's still pretty new, and it is this stripy looking fabric. And what they've done is they have actually added right on here your cut lines to cut this at exactly 2.5 inches. And so you can cut your binding into 2.5 inch strips. And because of the printing on here, and you'll notice there's lots of different stripy print lines, because of the printing on here, when you fold this in half, you get one version or another version. And when this is wrapped around the quilt like this, you can have this on the front and this on the back, or vice versa. Or when you wrap it around this way, you can have it so that this floral is wrapped around the edge. Now I'm going to have a tough time deciding which way I want this binding to face when I put it on my quilt, because I love both of those options. I think they're super cute. But the first step is to cut this apart. Now, one question that happens a lot with the 2.5 edition binding is, so this is straight cut binding, not bias binding? And the answer is yes. This is designed as straight cut binding, not bias binding. Bias binding you want when you are doing any kinds of curves or odd shapes, like inset corners, anything like that. But straight cut binding is just fine for everything else. So if your quilt is a rectangle, or in this case a square, today's quilt is a square, which is technically a rectangle, it's just an equilateral rectangle, then straight cut binding will work perfect. Another question is, well, Caroline, why aren't you rotary cutting this? Well, I could rotary cut this, but I wouldn't want to rotary cut it with it double folded, because if you double fold it, you can't keep an eye on where that line is. And sometimes fabric will have some stretch or shift to it, and then I'll end up being off track. So I'm hand cutting this with scissors, though you can totally cut it with a rotary cutter and a ruler. You just want to make sure that you're only cutting one layer of the fabric at a time. Now, if you have any other questions about using AGF 2.5 edition for your quilt projects, go ahead and leave those questions down below in the description. And I'll be happy to answer those. I'm happy to do more videos on AGF 2.5 because I have quite a few more quilts that need a binding. I sent several to Tammy, and then also I'm working on several myself. So I have lots and lots of binding to get through this year, and I'm happy to do more videos on different kinds of binding and playing with AGF 2.5 edition in different ways, because this fabric, this is so fun. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut this into strips. I need enough strips to go all the way around my quilt, which is going to be 4 strips of this AGF 2.5 edition fabric. And then we are going to get it all prepped and ready to go on the quilt. All right, I'm back and I set up my pressing station with my iron, and I actually ended up cutting 5 strips instead of just 4 because the 5 strips will give me enough to make sure that I have overlap at the end when I put the binding on the quilt. Okay, I'm going to switch out my presser foot. I have the 1/4 inch guide on here, and that's going to get in the way when I go to put these binding pieces together. I'm going to swap it out for my J foot here on my Baby Lock Jubilant. There we go. And now I'm going to put these binding strips together. Now we want to make sure that when we put the binding strips together, that we put them together in the right direction. So the way to remember to do this is that we've got one non-printed selvage end to one printed selvage end. And granted, okay, this printed selvage end has the white, but here's another part of it. That's the printed selvage end. So you want basically opposites attract, and that's what's going to keep this going in the same direction. If I were to do printed selvage end to printed selvage end, you could see that it'll end up having my flowers broken up. Now if I wanted to have 2 different kinds of binding on here to give it an interesting look and have the binding swap out between the 2 different styles, you can totally do this on purpose. But I want to have just one style of binding on here, which I think I'm settling on this floral because I think it's going to be so cute. So I'm doing this. And we're going to take our binding, we're going to put it right sides together at a 90-degree angle, and we're going to sew right here. And what does sewing right here do? That separates the part we're going to cut off, so the 2 waist ends, from the part we're going to keep, which is the 2 long ends. So that's how you remember which way to sew. There's some people who sew this way because it feels natural, and then when they go to open up their binding, they end up with strips like this, and that's no good. You want to remember that you are sewing so that you have your waist on one side and your good on the other. So I'm going to take these 2 pieces, I'm going to bring them over to my sewing machine, and the better these are squared to each other, the better all this is going to line up. But I'm okay with it not being exactly perfect, although it is nice if it looks good. All right. So I'm going to sew diagonally right across this. There we go. Now you can chain piece all of these, and I probably will chain piece the rest, but I just want to check this and see how well I did. Okay, that's pretty darn good in terms of lining up. Okay, so I'm going to take one end, throw it to the back, take my other end. Okay, this is a non-printed selvage end. So I need to have a printed selvage end, put them right sides together. So with my good on one side and my waist on the other. And I'm going to sew again, making sure these are lined up really nicely. And now I can chain piece these, grabbing the end of the piece that I just sewed, the printed selvage to the non-printed selvage. Trying to have as little waste as possible on here. And we'll keep going, attaching all of these to one another, and then we're going to get ready to press them. So I have all my strips sewn together, and I can cut off that extra. There are a couple ways that you can do this. You can either cut across and then cut off the dog ears. I like to do both at the same time. So I'm going to cut parallel with that strip right up against it, and then trim this to about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then trim off the other side. And I'll just go ahead and do this with all of them at once because there's only 4 seams with 5 strips. and I'm going to answer a question that I think some people are going to ask, which is, if you're doing straight cut binding, why are you sewing these seams at a diagonal? And that's a great question. I'm sewing these seams at a diagonal because it reduces the bulk on the binding. So if I had a straight seam on this, when it wrapped around the edge of the quilt, the seam would be on top of each other multiple times. This, because it's at an angle, as it wraps around, it's not going to fold over on itself as much, and so you won't end up with a lump in the side of your binding. Well, that's a great question. All right, this is double fold binding, which means that we are doing 2 layers, and we're just going to press this in half right here. So I have a hot iron. I'll bring my little iron trivet over here. And I'm doing this on a wool mat. This is actually the Elisa wool mat that extends. And I'm just pressing this in half so you can see one side and see the other side. And I'm going to keep pressing this in half until I get to the seam. I'm just about there. And when I get to the seam, I'm going to press this seam open. Even if you always press everything to the side, it's still worth it to press your binding seams open. The biggest reason that people press to the side versus open is because they say that you have like air basically between these 2 pieces of fabric. Now that you've pressed it open, there's no overlap. But because we are pressing this binding in half, there will be fabric behind it, there will be overlap. So it negates that reason for not wanting to press your seams open. And there is a huge benefit to pressing it open with binding, which is that it takes that bulk and it spreads it out. So instead of having 3 layers of fabric right there, you have 2 and 2. So that is, again, going to reduce the bulk on the seam and reduce the chances that that seam is going to be lumpy and have a lump in the edge of your binding. So even side pressers, die-hard side pressers, go ahead and press your binding seams open. All right, I'm going to keep going and press all of my binding in half. And then we're going to be ready to actually apply it to the quilt top. All right, I have my binding all prepped and rolled up. I usually roll it just around my hand, and it makes a nice little packet that I can set aside until it's time to add the binding. Some people actually prep their binding while their quilt is at the long armor, so that when the quilt comes back from the long armor, they're good to go. Generally not that organized. So my quilt's been here for months and I've finally prepped my binding. Okay, so we're going to attach it to the quilt, and we're going to attach it to the quilt the same way that I attach binding to a quilt normally, which is that I line up the binding with the edge of the quilt top. So yes, there is extra batting here, but we don't want to line it up with the edge of the batting. I'll show you why. Okay, so first step is, which direction do you want the binding to be? And the answer is, this is the side that I'm going to want to see on my finished quilt, so I don't want that here. So the binding has to go this direction because this is what's going to be hiding. Now, if I were to attach the binding here on the batting, if I did a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I would end up with it all stitched on batting and not stitched on quilt, which would be bad. And if I did a big enough seam allowance to actually catch the quilt, I'd have no actual binding left to wrap around the quilt. So I need to start it here and then stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because of the direction that I'm going on this quilt, I actually rolled this the wrong way. I need to go from, here we go, the inside of my roll to get this the right direction. I want to give myself a good, 8 or 10 inches before I start, and that'll give me enough space to be able to stitch the 2 ends together once I get all the way around. So I'm going to give this a quick pin. Now some people like to pin their binding all the way around the quilt and make sure that there aren't any seams that are going to be at corners. I like to live dangerously. It should probably be fine, right? Maybe I'll end up with a seam in a corner and I'll deal with it. Maybe I won't. Alright, we'll take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch this with a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we go. I'll actually go just scant of a 1/4 inch. Now, scant is one of those words that it's like, what is a scant 1/4 inch? A scant 1/4 inch is like a thread or two less than a 1/4 inch. Your scant might be a little different than my scant. That's okay. For some people, it means that they actually move the needle over one position. My Jubilant will move the needle over, but it's more than one little notch, so I won't do that with this one. And I'm just going to stitch this on with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, I made it up to a corner, and once I get, it's like 3 or 4 inches, maybe 5 inches away from a corner, I flip the binding. Let me do this left-handed so you can see. So I flip the binding over here, and then flip it back. And this point right here is at the point of the quilt. And I'm going to flip this little shark fin of a tab back towards me so it's out of the way. If I need to do any adjusting, here's the point where I do any adjusting. And now the binding is at a right angle with and lined up with the edge of the quilt. So I like to go all the way up to a 1/4 inch away, go back and forth, and then I flip everything, flip that shark fin. If things need to be adjusted again, here's another chance to do that. Make everything nice and smooth. And then I will grab it again at that 1/4 inch away. And start sewing. Alright, I'm a couple inches away. Look at that. I did manage to get a seam in the corner. It happens. This what happens when you don't pre-pin. You end up that way. Okay, so I flip it so that this edge of my quilt lines up with the edge of the binding. Then I flip it back the other direction, and then I flip the shark fin. Double check that everything's lined up well. That looks good. I stitch up to about a 1/4 inch away, go back and forth to secure it, flip it over, start again about a 1/4 inch away, back and forth, and then I keep going on my merry way. I'm going to go ahead and do 2 more corners and finish up about 10, maybe 15 inches away from where I started to be able to line up these strips and sew them together. We've made it all the way around the quilt and we have our 2 ends that we need to bring together. This is super simple to do. If you haven't seen this technique before, then you haven't watched any of my binding videos. I have a bunch of binding videos. Okay, we're going to about somewhere middle-ish cut just one of these binding strips because both of them are way longer than I need. Then I'm going to take that binding strip, going to open it up so it's unfolded, and lay it out with the edge here of the binding strip that I just cut. I'm going to take the other binding strip, lay it across, and cut it, making sure just to cut this top layer. I'm not cutting the binding strip underneath. And so the overlap between these 2 binding strips is the same as the width of the binding strip. And when you do that, that way you'll make sure that everything will line up. It's magic. It really is. Okay, so I'm going to take the 2 ends and I'm going to put them right sides together with no twist. So just like this. And if you want to double check, you can kind of pull it flat, make sure there's no twist in there. These will line up the two sides, so there's no sticking out part. And I'm going to go ahead and put a couple pins in here. I don't do a ton of pinning, we know this, but on stuff like this where I don't want it to shift so that I have to reposition when I get to the machine, I'll do a couple pins, and that way hopefully I'll get no shift, and definitely I won't have to completely redo it at the machine, which sometimes ends up with a twist getting in there. Okay, I'm going to bring it over to the sewing machine. And pulling this quilt up to give everything as much slack as possible. There we go, so it's nice and flat. I'm going to sew from one corner, and I can't really see my other corner, it's right there. There we go. I'm going to just stitch. Now if you like drawing a line instead of eyeballing, you totally can draw a line, that's fine. And now before trimming anything off, I want to double check that everything's nice and smooth and flat. That looks pretty darn nice and smooth and flat to me. So now I can go in and trim this to my eyeballed 1/4 inch. And you can press this open, you can press it with your iron. I still have my iron out, I could go grab that, but I'm just going to finger press this, which is what I usually do. And now I can finish sewing this on. And I started sewing where I already had some stitches, and then I keep going. So this seam overlaps on both ends the previous seams. There we go. But just a couple inches. And that way I know it's secure. All right, so the binding is on the front. I'm going to press it towards the back so that I get a nice crisp front line on this. So I still have my iron plugged in and ready to go. I'm going to put this on my pressing mat, and now we'll actually get to see the binding up on the quilt. How fun is that? That is such a cute edge on this quilt. So in some spots I can see the basting stitches that the quilter used to attach the quilt. So I'm just going to clip it from the front. I should be able to pull it from the back and hide those basting stitches. There we go. And now I can press this binding towards the back or towards the side. That is such a fun binding. Alright, so I'm just going to press this all the way around, and then we'll work on attaching it to the back. So I have my binding pressed from the front, and if you look, the binding is really not that much bigger than this extra fabric that I have here, so I need to move some of this extra fabric out of the way. I'm actually going to fold this in. So this is my backing fabric that I'm folding in towards the front, and then I can bring the binding to the back. And I'm going to just put this with a pin for now. So we'll flip this over and you can see what this looks like from the back. Is that I'm taking this backing and I'm tucking it under. That allows me to bring my binding to the back. Now this is a chalk full stuffed binding. So this is not one that is going to be easy for me to machine bind. So this is going to be a binding that I'm going to hand bind down, which is totally fine. I know we love doing machine binding when we can, because machine binding is quick and easy and finished. But because we have this nice full stuffed binding, we want to hand bind this down. Now you can use clips to secure this instead of pins if you prefer. Clips are less likely to poke you. But I wanted to pin this for a second so you could see how cute that binding looks. And then we're going to hand sew this down. We're going to hand sew it onto the back. And we're just going to make sure that that binding extends past the stitching line of our stitching the binding onto here. So I'm going to go ahead and thread a needle and show you how easy it is to hand stitch this down. Alright, so instead of starting over here, I'm actually going to start kind of further in, so that way when I get around to this end, I don't have to try to tuck the backing and batting in. It'll already be tucked in over here, and I'll have some open space to be able to tuck this spot here. Alright, I'm going to remove a pin and have my needle threaded. And I'm going to start, so this little gray thread here, hopefully you can see that. That gray thread right there, that is the stitching that is stitching the binding to the front. And I'm going to start by burying the end of my little thread here. And then I'm doing 3 stitches in place. Some people like to do a knot. My preference is always 3 stitches in place, because I feel like that's going to be more secure than a knot, and I spent enough of my quilting time getting knots out. If you really want a knot, just go through the loop. And if you can't remember, if you've already done 3 stitches, just do another one, because doing 4 stitches is fine. And if you want to go through that loop as well, you totally can. Now that I have secured this, I'm going to bring the thread up on the outside of that stitching line. I'm going to bring the binding fabric up as well. I'm just going to grab the edge of the binding fabric, bring it up. Then I'm going to stitch really close to where my stitch up was, go about 1/8 of an inch or so further, and do the same thing. I'm grabbing just the very edge here. Oh, my loop looped around my pin. There we go. And these first couple stitches are going to feel a little tricky to do because we're pulling the binding into place. After these first couple stitches, it should go easier. Grab the edge of the binding. Alright, I'm going to keep working on stitching that till we get to the corner, because the corner has all that extra bulk. I'm going to show you how we're going to treat that a little differently. Alright, I've made some good progress on this binding. It looks so cute. I just love this binding on this quilt, and I love the side that I picked. We're going to make it towards the corner here. So let's look at how we're going to bind this corner. Alright, so I have our corner here, and if I try to shove all of this in here, I've got way too much extra. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut off half on the diagonal. So I'm folding this in to my stitch line, and I'll cut, this is just the backing fabric, and that'll be my guide to cut the batting as well. If I were to try to fold over both the backing fabric and the batting, it'd be a lot to fold over at once, and that would be really tough to do. And so now I can fold this side in and the other side in, and basically that batting and that backing is going to miter around. So now that I have that corner, I can bring one side up. Make sure this is tucked in nicely. Bring that other side in, and that will give me my mitered corner for my binding. Oh, didn't want to grab that little corner right there. There we go. And I can continue going around the other side like this. And there we go. I'll have a full corner on my binding, and here's what it looks like from the front. Now, a question I know I'm going to be asked down in the comments if I don't answer it here is, how does this binding differ from the binding that I've done in the past? So this is a quilt that I did with AGF 2.5 edition. I cut it down to 2 inches for this project, and so you can see the difference between these two bindings. So here we go. This one was done with 2-inch binding. This one was done with 2.5. So you can see the difference in width right there. And then this, you can see, is fairly thin. And this has a lot more thickness and dimension to it, which is really nice for this edge decor that it wraps around a nice thick binding. This one has some definite dimension on it. This one is a lot flatter. Alright, so I definitely need to finish binding this quilt. Hand binding it will take me, on a quilt this size, it'll take a couple hours for sure, going and hand stitching, but it is such a relaxing and soothing process to just sit and hand bind a quilt. I don't do it that often. Who knows, maybe this will convert me back and I'll want to do it more. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Make sure you've given this video a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to this channel, you should be. I have a bunch of binding videos for you, and I have lots more videos coming, so you don't want to miss any of those. Friends, that's all for today. I will see you right here real soon. Bye for now.